So thanks to those who have joined us for this live webinar. My name's Tegan McBride. I'm the Sustainable Agriculture Project Officer with Reef Catchments. We're the Natural Resource Management Organisation for Mackay Whitsunday Isaac Region. We work with farmers to help them adopt best practices in land management. This particular project is funded under the Australian Government National Landcare Program, and it really has two focus areas. One's about helping farmers adapt to changes in market demands, so what the consumer wants, and the other part is about helping them to adapt to climate change. Today's webinar is all about the longer term strategies to prepare your property to be as resilient as possible through the climate variability and extremes that are expected, and some of which we're experiencing now. We have two other videos on climate risks and adaptation available on our Reef Catchments YouTube channel. So if you're interested, jump on there, and this presentation will be available there afterwards as well. Today we're fortunate to have one of the leaders in regenerative and holistic land management in Australia with us, Terry McCosker from RCS. Welcome.
Thanks, Tegan. Welcome, everybody.
So Terry, you've had a great deal of experience in land management in Australia. I'd be interested to hear what's your concept of holistic management?
Well, I've got a picture of a duck on the screen, and I think I'll start with reductionism because that's what we're used to seeing. And if we look at that duck, or an anatomist looks at that duck, or a vet looks at it, they can probably identify all the parts of that duck. But in reality, can they ever find the duck's thoughts? Can they ever find whether that duck loved anything? Can they ever find its quack, for example? So in other words, the duck is a lot more than the sum of its parts. And reductionism is what we're so used to in agriculture and in medicine, where we've ended up now looking at such fine detail that we've forgot the importance of systems and the way the world operates. And we're getting further and further down rabbit holes. So the alternative to that is holism. And I love this little statement from John Muir, and he says that when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. And that really is a lot of what holism is about. So to me, it's looking at all the wholes. So we're looking at a business, for example, there's people in that business, there's ecosystems in that business, there's livestock, there's crops, there's soil, there's biology, there's biodiversity. And when we look at a property, we actually need to be looking at all of those things. And instead of spending more and more time looking at how we can fine-tune fertiliser, for example, we need to step back and say, do in fact we need it, or can Mother Nature actually provide the inputs that fertiliser or that artificial input was that we're putting in. And when we look at it from the perspective, for example, of a family business, there's basically, our business is a little bit like a three-legged pot, and there are three primary legs to that pot. So there's production, and whether we're cropping, whether we're growing cane, we're in horticulture, whether we're got livestock, it doesn't really matter. We've got a production system or a production leg to our pot. We've also got a land management leg, which basically covers our soil health and how we're managing that ecosystem. And then we've got a business leg, which comes down to how well we're managing the business. But the fourth component of that pot is the people. And we need to be in the pot reaping the benefits of those three legs. Now, if we look at agriculture generally today, we find that those three legs are out of balance. If I look at production systems, generally that's where our focus is. So production systems, we might be across the board 50 to 80% effective when it comes to how we produce things. But when it comes to managing land and looking after land as an ecosystem and as something that needs to be producing for another 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 years, I think we're probably managing that to about 5 to 10% of what we should be. And over the last few years, I've had a lot of banks come through schools that I've been running, and they tell me that they consider most agricultural businesses, about 10% of agricultural businesses are managing their business effectively, with enough focus on business analysis and an understanding of how to actually manage, analyse and react to what's going on within the business itself.
So we're really looking forward to hearing more about that holistic concept, and 25 of our producers will be able to do a full 2-day introduction with you in October this year, which is going to be really wonderful. We can get into all those different legs and the people, and then go on that journey for the next few years through holistic farm management. So today I think we'd like to focus a little bit on those land management practices that you were talking about. Would you mind telling us some of the principles of that component?
Certainly. I think it's becoming pretty clear globally now. There's a set of principles that have evolved, and this is my take on them. And I think the first principle is what I call planning, monitoring and managing for soil health. It's not going to happen by itself, and this principle is for the people, and it's about management. And if we turned this upside down and looked at it as a pyramid, management is actually the basis. And it's the human mind that's determining the outcomes in our business and in our landscapes. So I put the people at the top of the food chain here, because without management, the rest of these principles won't be applied. The second principle is maximise living plant production, and that really means that we have crops or plants growing on soils continuously. We do not want bare ground. Mother Nature abhors a vacuum, and she will always try and put something in it. And for example, when we're in annual cropping, we're always poisoning plants and trying to get rid of stuff that Mother Nature's putting in there to try and heal whatever we've done to it. And we need to accept those as part of the ecosystem and work out how to manage around those, or put alternative plants in that are going to be of more benefit to us. So basically, the second principle means having plant production for as long as there is moisture every year, but having plants there that have the ability to grow at any point in time, whether it's summer, winter, dry season, wet season, etc. And I think that many of us, and certainly of my era, and I go back 50 odd years in agriculture professionally, when I studied soil science, etc., we learned about physics, about ploughing and different systems of turning soil over, etc., and the impact of that, and how we needed air in the soil and we needed structure, etc. We also learned a lot about chemistry, but we never ever talked about biology. We know now that biology is the driver of both physics and chemistry. And so as I look at ecosystems now, I look at it from the point of view of biology. And what do we actually need to get our biology functioning effectively? And there's 4 criteria that biology needs, and that is food, shelter, water, and air. And that's no different from us. We need food, shelter, water, and air. And virtually every living thing needs food, shelter, water, and air. And I think we need to consider that everything below and around the surface of the soil also needs that same consideration. And if we focus on biology, it's a good place to start to regenerate the change that we need. And I don't think we're going to get a lot of the changes we need unless we have biodiversity in the systems. Biodiversity of cropping, biodiversity of plants, biodiversity of biology, all of those things actually contribute to production. And I think there's a perception in agriculture generally that biodiversity is a greenie type concept. And that couldn't be further from the truth, because biodiversity is an underlying principle of productivity and being able to do agriculture for the next 1,000, 2,000 or 5,000 years. And those are the timeframes we need to be thinking of. I mean, we're too short-sighted in the way we look at what we're doing to our agricultural systems. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about biodiversity a little bit later. We want maximum thickness and availability of ground cover. So if we are going to have an area where crops are not growing actively, then we've got to have ground cover. So if we're in a pasture system, for example, and we're not getting production, then we've got to have litter or plants that are not active but filling that space. In cropping systems, we've got to be leaving litter behind. So that's part of the shelter and the food that soil biology needs, and it helps with biodiversity within the biology of soils. And the last of these principles is that nature put ruminant animals on Earth to recycle plant material. And in many ecosystems, we actually still need to bring animals back into cropping systems. So whether it's sugarcane, whether it's any other crop we're running, whether it's an orchard or whether it's a vineyard, we need to bring livestock back into those systems, to recycle a whole lot of stuff. And generally 60 to 80% of what an animal recycles is plant available nutrients. And the other thing about a ruminant is that about 85 to 90% of what they eat ends up back on the ground in the form of dung and urine. So 80-90% of what they eat recycled, and then 60 to 80% of that recycled material is available for plant production.
Right.
So I see those as sort of key fundamental principles that if we can manage by those, we're actually going to regenerate our entire ecosystem and our production systems.
There's some big concepts there. I mean, on a practical level, with businesses that you've worked with, could you tell us some of the some examples or some stories about businesses that have incorporated these principles and that are actually created a stronger business for themselves both now and a more resilient land for them in the future?
Well, I think one of the outstanding examples has been pasture cropping in central west New South Wales, where businesses have significantly, whether they're getting pretty well the same crop yields or slightly less, but inputs have reduced by up to 80-odd%. So there's a lot of cost structure taken out of the business. At the same time, soil health has started to improve. Then you bring livestock into the system, which reduces the risk. So if you just crop and then kill whatever comes up between annual crops on your soil, you have very little risk management going on within your business. If you have something like pasture cropping, then you've got pasture to graze between crops, and you graze them from the moment the last crop is harvested to the moment the next crop is planted, which means that your landscape is actually productive for 12 months of the year. And it's also generating income for 12 months of the year instead of throwing money at it in the non-growing season when we're trying to do the traditional fallow where we spray out everything that grows. That's one example. There's many more in the grazing industry. As we get the ecosystem going, the water use efficiency of yield in pastures increases quite significantly. The biggest I've seen based on real data is a 10-fold increase in carrying capacity in desert country, where we've gone from 3 stock days per hectare per 100 mils, and that carrying capacity is quite typical of spinifex sand dunes in Australia, and taking that same country right up to 30 stock days per hectare, which is double what most people would be carrying on buffel grass in central Queensland, for example. So that's a tenfold increase in carrying capacity. Generally through Queensland, we very quickly see a doubling of carrying capacity within about a 5-year period as that ecosystem improves. In some cropping systems, I've seen in some cane production, for example, fertiliser reduced by 28% and yield increased by 50% in the same crop. So I think what that's saying is there's a whole lot of possibilities for us to work our systems a lot better.
And do you have any examples of how these have been implemented in, say, sugarcane or grazing, coastal grazing properties at all? Most of the growing here, the agriculture here is cane, grazing, and increasingly more horticulture, tree crops and small crops. So do you have some examples of how these principles can be incorporated into some of those systems?
Well, I think cane's a good example. If we just look at the thought processes in cane and the long-term paradigms, the paradigms are that we just keep pouring nitrogen into the system and we just keep putting stuff on to the soil. If we take phosphorus, for example, various forms of phosphorus, and particularly something like diammonium phosphate, actually kills between 30 and 80%, or 70% rather, between 30 and 70% of the mycorrhizal fungi in a soil, which is what feeds the plant phosphorus. So we're actually putting on stuff to soils which is harmful. The other thing which we're doing, I think, that needs to change significantly is the amount of nitrogen that's being used. Mother Nature will produce as much nitrogen as we need. There is 78,000 tonnes of nitrogen sitting above every hectare of soil that everybody owns. Yeah. And if we get the biology working effectively, and we don't need legumes, the old paradigm is that we must have legumes to get more nitrogen into a system. But the thing that drives nitrogen in a system is actually soil carbon. Now, as carbon goes up, there is more nitrogen circulating in the system. So, and that's because the biological system wants to retain a carbon-nitrogen ratio in the soil at about 12 to 1. So generally it might be 11 to 1, 12 to 1, 13 to 1. You'll see most soil analysis sit at that level. Now, it doesn't matter whether the carbon level is very low in the soil or the carbon level is very high in the soil, the 12 to 1 ratio is the same. And that means that as we add carbon to the soil, we're adding nitrogen. So if we add, and in cane it would be quite easy to add 3 tonnes of carbon per hectare per annum to a soil, and possibly 10 tonnes of carbon per hectare per annum to a soil, and keep building that within the system. So if we add 10 tonnes of carbon per hectare to a soil, we have just added just under a tonne of nitrogen per soil, which is plant available. Yeah. So why would we bother putting it on a bag out of a bag when we can get Mother Nature to provide it for us? The thing that's preventing us, and this is the irony of it, the thing that's preventing us from increasing soil organic carbon is the amount of nitrogen we're using. Because when we get too much nitrogen in a system relative to carbon, the bugs in the soil chew up the soil carbon, which actually reduces it. So what we've got to do in cane, for example, is slowly start pulling the artificial nitrogen out as we add biodiversity with biology to both plant cane and ratoons to help the soil biology increase its biodiversity so it can actually start generating the nitrogen that we need. And the system that the soil uses to generate nitrogen is pretty simple. If we increase bacterial population, that increases the bacterial feeding protozoa population. And the carbon-nitrogen ratio in a bacteria is 5:1, but the carbon-nitrogen ratio in a protozoa is 50:1.
Yeah.
So that means a protozoa's got to consume 10 bacteria to get 50 units of carbon. But when it does that, it's actually got 10 units of nitrogen, which it can't use. So it spits out the extra 9 units of nitrogen into the soil, which then becomes plant available. We did a little trial years ago on pasture, and in 1 year, the change went from 120 units of nitrogen circulating in the biological system to 540 units of nitrogen circulating in the biological system, simply by managing the grasses in a grazing system. So all we did was manage the grass, which allowed the grass to produce more sugar. That put more sugar into the root systems. That sugar fed the bacteria, which increased in population, which increased the protozoal population, which increased the amount of nitrogen. Mother Nature's actually, she's got a handle on all of this stuff. If we think we know more than she does, and we try to circumvent what she does, then we're in real trouble.
That's right, she's the boss.
She's the boss. If we look at it this way, what we want in an agricultural system is gross margin. We need profitability to be able to stay in agriculture. And profitability is a key component of sustainability and regenerative agriculture. If we're not profitable, nothing else can happen. But if we just look at cane, for example, then gross margin is a function of plant productivity. So whether we're getting 80 tonnes of cane per hectare or 150 tonnes of cane per hectare, that will determine our gross margin per hectare. The productivity itself is a function of plant available water and nutrients. Now, with our old NPK paradigm, we think that, if we put on X amount, then that's pretty good. But if we treble that, then it must be 3 times as good. In fact, that 3 times as much is actually doing damage to the nutrient cycle and the biology. Yeah. So plant available water and nutrients are a function of cation exchange capacity. Now, many of our cane soils are alluvial soils, so they're silt-based or sandy textured soils rather than clay-based soils. So the thing that drives cation exchange in those soils is soil organic carbon. And yet a lot of our soils in the cane industry are down at less than 1% organic carbon. So if we're going to get the cation exchange capacity up, we've got to get the soil organic carbon up. But soil organic carbon build-up is a function of biological activity. So we can't get carbon up without mycorrhizal fungi. So then we go and put on a whole lot of phosphorus, for example, which kills the mycorrhizal fungi, so we can't store more carbon or develop it within the soil. And biological activity, as I mentioned earlier, is a function of food, shelter, water and air. So then if you go a little bit further, food, shelter, water and air is actually a function of plant productivity, which is a function of plant available water and nutrients. Yeah. So when you put that together, what you see is a cycle. And Mother Nature just is cycle sync. That's holistic. That's actually looking at the whole thing from the business right through to what Mother Nature's doing for us in a holistic way, and everything there depends on everything else. Our choice then as a manager of landscapes is we can allow that the way we manage it to continue to spiral our ecosystems downwards, or we can choose a management system that spirals the ecosystem up. So if you're looking at that screen there on the left-hand side, there's just 2 different operators in the same district and with the same rainfall. One of those was taken to one in October last year after some rain. The guy that was managing his grass grew a lot of grass. The guy on the right-hand side grew very little. In January 2019, when there hadn't been a lot of rain, you'll see the guy on the right is going potentially into winter with no feed. The guy on the left still has feed. And if he gets a shower rain on that, he will grow stuff. On 2 inches of rain, he'll grow what's in the top photograph. Yeah. The guy on the left will grow very little. the guy on the right, the guy on the right has an ecosystem that is spiraling down. So then that whole chain of events, which I just went through, is taking our ecosystem backwards. And the guy on the left is actually managing it to take it up. You know, it doesn't matter whether we're growing cane, pineapples, macadamias, or cattle or sheep. The principles are identical, and it doesn't matter where you're doing it. So we need to be looking at how we actually increase that. And this diagram here looks a little bit complex, but I'll just explain it simply. And it's the biodiversity and biology in a soil. So the top group across there, and the amount of green is an indication of both the volume and the diversity of various forms of biology. So on the top line, where it had been treated with a compost, you'll see there's a lot of green. That means that there's a lot more diversity in the soil biology. The controlled area, which had been cropped but had no compost treatment put on it, you'll see a lot less green, and therefore there's a lot less numbers of the species that are there, but also a lot less diversity in the species that are there. And the last lot is that soil without crops grown on it. So and this was on a desert soil. Now, what I want to point out now is if we look vertically on those lines, you'll see that the species which were dominant in a soil that was not growing plants have disappeared in a soil that's growing plants, healthy plants. So I find that actually fascinating, in that we can completely change the biology, firstly with management, and secondly by adding some biodiversity to that biology.
So same soils, just treated with compost, and the other one wasn't?
So the topsoil was treated with compost, no fertiliser, and crops grown twice a year under irrigation. So this is a desert, it's in desert country, and those crops were harvested and carted off.
Yeah.
The control was where crops grew, but were also harvested and carted off, but there was no compost and no fertiliser put on that. And the bottom one was the original soil that hadn't grown any crops, so it hadn't. So you can see that the impact of actually just having plants growing for 12 months of the year, basically, also increases the biological diversity. And then the top one had a particular type of compost, which is a very biodiverse compost, one you can make yourself and do it very, very cheaply. It comes from a non-turned aerobic compost. Very easy to put on and very, very cheap. So we're doing trials with that now, that type of compost, where we're using the equivalent of about 3 to 5 kilograms of compost per hectare, applied in liquid form and applied into the soil, and with cane, for example, at planting. And also another way to increase that biodiversity is through companion cropping or cover cropping with different species. And again, I'll just show you, well, this is wheat country in West Australia, and you can see how crooked this country is. Up in the top left-hand side, you can see the salt lakes. The pH on this soil is about 4.3, which most crops won't grow in. Now that's a plant there that I had just pulled out of the soil at random, out of that soil. It's basically, I call that West Australian loam, which is a mixture of sand and salt. And you'll notice that that was a wheat plant that had 15 mils of rain, and that's all that it had, no stored moisture.
Yeah. But
look at the soil attached to those roots, and notice how big the plant is relative to the volume of roots. Now those plants there had the equivalent of about between 1 and 3 kilograms of compost dribbled in as that seed was sown, no fertiliser, And this particular property has not used any fertiliser now for 8 years.
Just
and
compost.
Just compost extract at between 1 and 3 kilograms per hectare. And also a bit of worm juice at 5 litres per hectare. So that's all of these crops are getting. And what they've found since they've added the biology to the soil is that they've had no diseases. So they've used no fungicide for that entire period, and they have used no insecticide for that entire period. Whereas conventionally grown crops across the fence have had diseases and had insect attacks.
So there's some natural resilience in that system by just using the biology.
Well, there is, and it's a well-known fact. It's actually been known since the 60s that when a plant is healthy, insects and diseases do not attack it. So insects and diseases are, in fact, Mother Nature's way of cleaning up rubbish. Whereas what's actually happening here, I'll try and describe it in another way. What's happening here is when the biology feeds the plant in the way the plant needs to be fed, then the plant is healthy, and therefore nothing attacks it. And the thing that you've actually got to get your head around here is that this is a highly intelligent system. When that seed germinates, it sends out a little root, and that it starts to exude signals and sugar to the biology around it. So that biology comes in, and that all of that soil attached to those roots is actually the biology holding it there. That biology is protecting those roots from a 4.3 pH. The biology is feeding that plant what it needs to be fed when it needs to be fed. So if on an hourly basis, if a plant needs a bit more calcium, it actually can signal to the biology to say, I need more calcium and bring it to me now. I need more water, bring it to me now. I need more zinc, I need more copper. Don't bring me any more phosphorus, I'm not at a stage where I need it. That communication is going on between the plants and the soil biology continuously. And
what's the biology getting in return?
What the biology is getting is carbon. So the biology in the soil has to get its energy from somewhere. So the plant takes about 40% of the energy that it produces each day in sugar, in the form of sugar, puts it down into the root system and exudes that sugar out into the soil. But when it's sending that sugar out, it attaches enzymes and phytochemicals and things which are actually the signals to the biology as to what the plant actually requires. So it's a very complex but very intelligent system, and what it needs is for us as humans to get the hell out of the way and let Mother Nature do it.
That's a really great explanation on the plant soil biology relationship, so thank you for that. So we focused a lot on soil health today and the biodiversity that's required underneath the soil and the plants within it, but what about like vegetation on farm, and what are the benefits of having diverse species, say windbreaks or areas for habitat for predatory animals? Do you want to talk a little bit on that?
Yeah, I haven't got any slides I can show you right now. I do have good examples of that, but what we have found in grazing systems is that the optimal canopy cover for trees is between 30 and 40% tree cover. And last Sunday I was out in a paddock about an hour or so west of Rockhampton, very dry, and there was a lot of trees. The guy there has just let his trees go. And when we arrived, a lot of people that were horrified at the amount of trees and sort of concerned about what was going to happen. When we got out in the paddock, they started to realise that there was actually more grass under the trees than there was outside the trees. The grass under the trees was not suffering from the dry weather. It was greener. There was double the volume of grass under the trees as there was outside the drip zones. Now, the key to achieving that is actually the grazing management system. And most people have never seen a tree effect separated from a grazing effect. And when we walk out into paddocks that are continuously grazed, the animals are actively selecting under trees because the phosphorus level, we know from measurements, is double the level in a plant as it is outside the drip zone. The protein level is 2 percentage points higher in plants under a tree than outside the tree. And so where's an animal going to eat? It's going to eat where it gets the most amount of nutrient out of the small number of bites, which is under a tree. And what most people have seen is bare areas under a tree, and they think that the tree's doing it. In reality, 80 to 90% of the time, it's the animals that are doing it. And the moment you change your grazing management system, there's a whole aha moment or a realization that, boy, oh boy, I should never pull that number of trees out. Then you get a whole lot of other things from those trees. So you get protection from frost, you get protection from wind. We know from measurements made where we've got sort of 30 to 40% canopy cover compared to open landscapes like that photo that's out there at the moment. That's an open landscape. Now the wind will suck most of the moisture out of that soil because it whizzes across the soil and just sucks it straight out. When we have enough trees, the wind stays off the ground, and the evaporation rate for the grasses under and around those trees is half that it is than if you've taken all the trees out. Then you've got spiders and insects and all sorts of other biology that's actually living in those trees, which is part of the biodiversity and part of the balance that Mother Nature keeps in things. A classic example of that in the wheat industry, for example, is microbats that live in trees. So if people leave scattered trees through a wheat crop, for example, in New South Wales, the microbats live in those trees and come out at night and eat insects. So they're actually doing a job, and if you take those trees out, you get rid of your microbats, and then you've got an insect thing that you've got to treat. And your plants are out of balance because the fertiliser you put on was not what the plant actually needed, and you forced it to take stuff up in a way that it didn't want to. So therefore the plant's out of balance and it's available for insect attack. So I think that we've got to think of biodiversity because for its productions on its impact rather on production, and not as some greeny concept. It's very important. And I think one of the best examples I've seen recently, and this is in cane, of the impact of biodiversity, and this is some stuff on Simon Matson's place. And if you look at the red down there, that is sugarcane roots not associated with sunflowers. So these soil samples were taken 3 months after sunflowers were harvested, dead, gone. And you'll notice that in sugarcane that had never been associated with sunflowers, there was 47,000 DNA copies of mycorrhizal fungi per gram of root. But where the sunflower had been, there's 955,000 DNA copies of mycorrhizal fungi per gram of root. There's also 4 mycorrhizal fungi that have shown up that are not there in where it's just cane on cane on cane. Now those mycorrhizal fungi can feed a plant from generally about 3 or 4 feet away. And they're the ones that go out and forage. They're the ones, rather than bacteria, the mycorrhizal fungi that go out and they bring back nutrients and water to a plant.
So they're doing the work for you.
They're doing the work for you, but they're the ones that we kill with various forms of phosphorus. And we don't do them a lot of good when we use a lot of nitrogen. This to me is a very powerful demonstration of the effect of actually growing something else in with your cane.
And that's a mixed, so those are co-planted, they're companion.
These were co-planted at that cane plant. So yeah. The cane was planted and the sunflower was planted, and then they both grew together. The sunflowers got up on top, then the sunflowers harvested, and the cane just kept going. There there was a positive impact on the cane. And I think we need, in the cane industry, we need to spend a lot more time doing that sort of stuff, whether it's sunflowers or whether we just go out straight after harvest and put 15 different species of anything out there to fill in the gaps between the cane rows, and let that build the biodiversity into our biology. And the reason that the biodiversity in biology is important is that it builds immunity into the crop. So the biology all work together then. Just trying to think of an analogy for that, but it's what builds within the soil then is a thing called quorum sensing. And quorum sensing is the way that biology communicates. So a good example of that would be if you're looking at a school of fish, and when a school of fish changes direction, they do it all instantly, all change in one direction. They don't wait for the leader to change and then the next one changes and the next one changes and they follow each other. When one changes direction, the entire school changes direction in the same instant. And you see the same with birds. If you look up and you see the birds, you'll see birds change direction instantly in a flock. That's called quorum sensing. It's the way biology communicates, and it's sort of something we don't necessarily understand how they do it, but we know they do it. And exactly the same thing happens to the complexity of biology within your soil. It communicates. And we know from some of the science now that I've got from the US is that as we increase the diversity within the soil, we build that quorum sensing capacity within the soil, which builds immunity into the entire system. It builds immunity into the soil, into the plants, into whatever animal is eating those plants, and right through into the human food chain.
Does that have something to do with the quantities or the diversity, or not really sure?
It takes diversity to build the ability to quorum sense. Part of what happens within quorum sensing is that different sections of biology can replace other bits. So if this bug over here on the left is not doing its job, then 3 over here on the right can actually step in and do that particular task. Mm. That's what we need. We need the diversity. There's some really good long-term research out of Europe that shows the communication between biology. So the more complexity, the more biodiversity we have within the biology, the more the communication happens between the biological units. And that, of course, helps everything. And a lot of this stuff is very new science, and it's really following on from the work that's been done on the human microbiome. So we've got to think about it in the human context, or it might be an easy way to think about it, is that soil has a microbiome, and the more complex and the more ability that microbiome has to manage itself, the healthier it's going to be. Plants have a microbiome, both at the root system and all over the leaf. The animals, whatever, eats that, we eat it. We take in that microbiome. If our own microbiome simplifies, we get sick because we don't have the immune system. Over 80% of the human immune system comes from our gut microbiome. And one of the most damaging things to gut microbiome and microbiomes in the soil, the plant, the animals and the humans is glyphosate. Because glyphosate shuts down the shikimate pathway, which is the energy transferring pathway within all of that biology. And while it's said that you can go and drink glyphosate and it won't hurt you, and that's correct, glyphosate per se won't hurt you, but what glyphosate does is really damaging our microbiomes, and particularly at the gut lining level and the blood-brain barrier, which is where a lot of our chronic diseases are coming from.
So looking at plants in a different way and seeing those non-desirables in a different light, maybe exchanging them out rather than killing them out, or poisoning them out.
Well, they're only undesirable to us for some reason, but Mother Nature's put them there for a reason. She might be putting deep rooted plants in there, for example, the purpose of those deep-rooted plants is to go down and pick up zinc, which the plants you're growing are deficient in. And every weed actually has a function. There's some good books coming out now that actually tells you what a lot of plants are accumulating. Unfortunately, they're US based, so not a lot of Australian data on that. But you'll find that different plants accumulate different things. So, you know, if you have a lot of hyptus growing in your paddocks, for example, when that hyptus is there for a reason. And if you want to know the reason, go and get it chemically analysed and figure out what it's very high in. Yeah. And that's what your soil is deficient in. So that even plant biodiversity, they all have their functions, and we tend to look at them from a very narrow reductionist perspective. So we've got to step back and be holistic again and realise that our system and every system we're playing with is run by its microbiome. And we've got to manage that microbiome, and the best way to manage it is to get the hell out of the way and let the microbiome and Mother Nature do what they know what to do.
So I grow a little bit too, but I know what happens when you get out of the way here. The weeds come up and, you know, you don't get your crop. And I do understand that there's, you know, there's some commercial aspects to that as well.
Absolutely there are. And I think that we might, and in a lot of cropping systems, we still need to use weedicides. In this cropping system here, they've had no need for fungicides or insecticides now for 8 years, but they still need to use weedicides to get a crop. But they do not use weedicides that have a big impact on biology. So they don't use glyphosate, for example, but they're still using weedicides. And I did an inventory of their weedicides a year ago, and they're using 15 different types of weedicide for different reasons in different countries for different purposes. But what you will find over time is that as your microbiome starts to grow and your soil health improves, the need for some of those things we call weeds actually reduces. Yeah. And we have less of a war against them as we go on. Yeah. But I fully understand, totally agree. There's a need for control of weeds, otherwise you don't get a crop. And if we don't get the crops, we'll all starve. But I think we need to really think about how we're doing that and the impact that we're having on all microbiomes, all the way from the soil to the human in what we're using.
Well, I'm really interested to see, you know, maybe some, like how a crimp roller would work in those systems, because like we were talking about before, we can't have a vacuum, we can't have any spare space. So if you're not interplanting with that, like density, maybe, or, you know, able to use, like, get out the quantities of mulch that you would need, maybe like cover cropping and crimp rolling, planting directly could be one option in small cropping.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that when you look around the world at the moment, I think the agricultural practice that is going gangbusters worldwide is actually multi-species cover cropping. You know, just everywhere. It's increasing its practice, and in Australia as well. So, and I think there's a lot of good reasons for that. And the reason it's increasing in the real world is that it's working. It's making a difference to soil health and biodiversity.
And not too hard to do, actually.
Not too hard at all. It does add a cost because sometimes, most of the time, you're not actually getting a yield off it, except maybe a grazing yield. And multi-species seed, the seed for multi-species crops are quite expensive, so there is a cost factor there.
Hey, Terry, we've got about 10 minutes left. Is there anything else you wanted to cover off on today?
I would like to, I was going to talk about, I won't bother with that. I think we'll finish off on this, but I was just wondering whether there was any questions that we needed to talk about or answer while we're on the line.
I'll have a look. Have a look if we've got any questions.
I love this little statement that I've got up there in nature. There are no rewards or punishment, only consequences. And it's very, very true. You know, whatever we do has a consequence. Nature doesn't punish us. She just gives us a consequence.
Feedback. Just while we're waiting to see if there's any questions coming through, I'll just reiterate that there is a 2-day course with Terry that Reef Catchments is putting on as a part of the Holistic Farm Management Project. So that'll start in July this year. Terry will be here in October. We've actually got something for the kids as well, which is going to be fantastic. Alongside that, we understand it's hard. The kids are going to be in school holidays. What are you going to do with them? We've got an ecological educator coming along to be able to get your kids involved, because we're talking about people and the farm as a whole. So that's pretty exciting as well. There are 2 major events that Reef Catchments hold every year, and one of those is the Grazing Forum, and so that's happening in March again this year. I think it's the 28th. So if you're just jump onto Reef Catchments website, our Facebook page, join up our mailing list, and you can keep up to date with all these fantastic events that we have. I don't want to name drop, but there are some seriously interesting people coming to Mackay this year for the Grazing Forum and for the Soil Symposium later in the year in November. You will not want to miss them. So lock it in, get it in your calendar. Doesn't look like we've got any questions, Terry. You must have covered it all.
Well, we certainly haven't covered it all, Tegan, but there's just a bit of an overview of things. But there's a lot more we can talk about and cover, and we'll try and cover some of that in the workshop that you're putting on later in the year. We'll at least have a couple of days to get into some of it. And 2 days is not enough either, but it'll be a reasonable start.
Well, it's been fascinating talking with you, Terry. It's a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
And good luck with the project.
Thank you. We'll catch you soon.
Good. Bye now.
Bye.